Hi guys, welcome back to Planet Mithril. My name is Mithril, and today I have a guide which shows you how to create 5 awesome looking different variations of cloak colours. Now, although I'm going to be demonstrating some of these on hero models, it's worth noting that these recipes can be used universally across any kind of rank and file or any kind of infantry model. It just happens to be the models that I've had available at the time of filming. Don't forget, if you like what we do, you can check us out over on Patreon and support us over there by joining our little community. But if you really like what we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon financially through the Treasure Trove tier, which gives you a host of online materials, as well as options for voting in future painting tutorials. Obviously, there is no obligation, but it is very much appreciated, and thank you to everyone who has supported us so far. Without further ado, brushes ready, let's get painting. So I'm going to demonstrate how to paint a really lovely rich blue cloak, and for this I'll be practicing on Prince Imrahil. Now for those beautiful vibrant blues, the cloak and shield outer are now being given a base coat using Keldor Sky. Again, you'll probably want to thin this down slightly just to help coverage. All the blues now are being shaded using Drakenhof Nightshade, working this into the recesses over the cloak and the horsecloth. Cloth and front of the shield now are getting layered up using Teclis Blue. You'll again need a few thinner coats of this, as the pigmentation of Teclis is a little less intense to apply one smooth coat. This being concentrated along the fine ridges of the cloak, leaving Drakenhof showing in the recesses. And pushing the folds and flow of the cloak further, applying a further layer, this time with a 3-to-1 mix of Teclis Blue and Lotherm Blue. There's a lot of movement in that cloak, which will be super easy to capture with careful paint application. The temptation to freehand paint blue wood grain here is unbelievable, let me tell you. Increasing the amount of Lotherm Blue in the mix now to a rough 1-to-1 or 50-50 split with Teclis Blue, and continuing to build up the upper tones of the cloak. You can see that I'm being a little bit more targeted and careful with my application here, and in the previous layers show underneath to try and blend the shadows through to the lighter upper tones. Now for the highlights. I'm going to begin by adding in a small amount of Baharov blue to the previous mix. Yes, this does make for a slightly complicated mix, but just look at that blue we're getting here. Absolutely stunning, if I do say so myself. To begin with, I'm operating with a rough 3-to-1 ratio split in favour of the previous layer mix. Baharov is very bright, so it can very easily oversaturate the richness of the blues if added too quickly. Quite simply, I'm continuing to add more Baharov blue in gradual increments to my mix for each successive highlight stage. You can take these upper level highlights as light as you want, depending on the overall look you want from your blues when they're done. Personally, I just went for one more highlight and just framing the hem of the cloak and picking out the most prominent lines down the folds, as well as catching the very edge of the shield rim. The final stage now is to apply another super diluted glaze, again with Tyron Blue, just to help tie the layers and highlights together. Who doesn't like a menacing black cloak? Ring wraiths and evildoers and Sith, and everyone loves a black cloak. And for this, I'll be detailing this on the Witch King of Angmar. Perfectly suitable. Now we're going to start base coating the robes with Abaddon Black mixed with a small amount of Incubi Darkness. This will just very, very subtly lift the tone from a jet black to a slightly off black, which will make the following highlighting and layering stages later on in the video all that more effective and all that more natural looking, rather than working from a jet black to a very light grey later on. We're going to start with the robes now by applying a manual shade of Abaddon Black to all the recesses on the cloak. This can also be achieved by a wash of Null oil, but then we risk upsetting the balance and smoothness of the base coat of the cloak. So a manual shade allows a lot more control and allows for a much better look once we're finished. Now we're going to very gradually start adding in Dawnstone to the previous Abaddon Black and Incubi Darkness mix. We've gone for approximately 1 part Dawnstone to 4 parts the original base coat mix, and we're going to apply this as a layer all over the model, leaving the Abaddon Black manual shade showing in the deepest recesses. Now we stress we want to add this in gradual increments, but make sure that you don't overload it with Dawnstone too quickly, as we want to build up a very gradual progression from the dark areas of robes to the lighter areas to keep it looking natural, warm, and as you would in the films. We're going to continue the process by adding more and more gradual increments of Dawnstone to the original base coat mix, and at each stage we're going to focus on pushing our layer stage a little bit closer to the edges of the cloak and all the apexes of all the folds of material, just to further reinforce that transition from the darker areas to the lighter areas of upper material. Once you finish this layer stage, your mix should contain no more than about 40% Dawnstone to the previous base coat mix. Once you're happy with how your layer stages look, we're going to repeat the process again, but this time adding small amounts of Administratum Grey. This will just help accentuate that Incubi Darkness in base coat mix, as well as raising the tone and pigmentation of the Dawnstone really naturally. Focus again on pushing this towards the upper areas of all the cloth and all the edges, just to create that seamless blend. Continue adding Administratum Grey in as smaller increments as you like. This is the final layer stage with this we're showing here. At this point, our mix contains no more than 50% Administratum Grey to the previous layer stage. This will avoid you overwhelming the pigmentation and the tone and making too stark a contrast between the darker and lighter areas. If you're happy with how this looks, using pure Administratum Grey now, we're going to apply a very, very fine edge highlight just to the very most upper and outer edges of all the robes, just to accentuate the points of light bouncing off the most raised areas of cloak. As you can see, we're not going down the whole length of all the robes here, we're just going off the very apex of all the curves and folds in the material.
Now it's time to move on to a really lovely camo-y green cloak. Great for all kind of Rohan or kind of Nordic races. Coincidentally, I'll be doing this on a warrior of Rohan.
The cloak I'm giving a base coat using wild flesh.
I'm applying this in a few thinner coats to make sure I get a smooth, crisp finish to build off. The entire cloak has been given an initial shade using Atholian Camo Shade. I have experimented both with Croak Shade and Beal Tan Green as well, and found them too dull and too bright respectively. I'm building up the layers now with a 4:1 mix of Wild Flesh and Zemesi Desert, leaving the wash showing in the recesses where I can. Some cloaks are flatter than others, so it's important to fully understand the flow of movement and texture over them before painting. This will help you be as accurate as possible. I've continued building up the layers until my mix is a rough 3:2 ratio between the Wild Flesh and Zemesi Desert, focusing on drawing out the flow and movement of the fabric with long, unbroken brushstrokes. When you reach the highlight stages, you want to be adding dawn yellow into the previous layer mix, whatever ratio you ended up with that. Starting gradually at first and building this up as much as you want, depending on how bright you want the upper, most prominent highlights to be. Finally, I'm applying a light glaze using heavily diluted Beal Tan Green, just to tie all my layers and highlights together.
Now onto some really nice beige cloak materials. Not quite so common, but I think one that needs to be tackled. So I'll be practicing this on Saruman. Now we're going to use a mix of Wraithbone and a little bit of Rakarth Flesh just to offset the tone, and apply this as a base coat to the entirety of the robes. This includes the outer robes, the inner robes, the boots, and any of the sleeves and cuffs. We're going to want to apply this in a couple of thin down layers to ensure we get a nice, smooth, consistent finish to the robes. If we can avoid any blemishing and blotches now at this stage, it's going to make the highlighting and layering stages so much easier. We're going to start applying some manual shades to all the robes and cloth on Saruman now, by adding in a small amount of Baneblade Brown to the original Wraithbone and Rakarth Flesh mix. Keep this as targeted as we can to really help create some depth and natural flow to all the cloth, as this is the biggest part of the model and arguably the crux of his overall appearance. Once you're happy with your initial shade, you'll apply a very, very light wash of Reikland Flesh shade just over all the robes, just to tie together the shade and the base layer and soften the transition between the darker and lighter areas at this stage. Once you're happy with how your shading looks, we're going to start adding in Ushabti Bone to the Wraithbone and Rakarth Flesh mix and start blocking out the larger areas of cloth and material over the model. We're keeping the percentage of Ushabti Bone here fairly minimal so that we don't end up overwhelming the look of the robes. So this can be super time consuming and frustrating, but take your time. There is a lot of cloth on the model and it's important to get all the layers blocked in properly and correctly for a good natural sense of flow and movement across all the material. We're going to try and keep the Reikland Flesh shade and the base coat shade showing in the deepest recesses, just to further help push that transition. With the cuffs in particular, work very carefully on blocking out all the individual filigree. Again, time consuming, but really worth the effort. By the time at which you've finished your blocking layers, your mix should contain no more than 50% Ushabti Bone and should look something like this. For the highlight stages, we're going to start adding in, you guessed it, Pallid Witch Flesh. For somebody called Saruman the White, we're not actually using an awful lot of white on his robes.
Contrast to Gandalf, his robes are a lot more beige, so we want to really focus on and push that aesthetic by choosing more of a muted, pastel-y palette, which I think complements this sculpt and ties in with the other areas on the model really nicely once we're finished. We're going to focus on pushing the block layers further by picking out the most raised details over the robes and just further reinforcing that sense of flow and movement across all the material. Keep adding in padded witch flesh in as many increments as you want until you get to a 50-50 split of padded witch flesh and the original layer mix. And by the time you're at the final highlight stage, you're looking at just defining the uppermost fold of all the material. And try and keep your brush strokes in as long, unbroken streaks as you can, with a nice tip to your brush to make sure all these highlights go where they want to go. Because the last thing you want to risk doing is undoing all the good work you've done at this point with the last highlight stage. Just picking out all the filigree with dot highlights to finish off the robes for our menacing wizard.
Now it's time to move on to a brown cloak, and for this I'll be practicing on Damrod.
The cloak was then base coated with a 4:1 ratio mix of Mornfang brown and Galvorback red. Now for yet another exercise in brown variation. This model probably uses nearly the whole range of Citadel browns. To start off, however, apply a manual shade to the recesses of the cloak with a 50-50 mix of Mornfang brown and Galvorback red. I'm jumping straight to the addition of Deathclaw brown in the mix, which is quite a stark addition, but this will bring up the tone of the cloak quicker and provide a nice degree of contrast against some of the more muted areas of brown that have already been finished. Again, increasing the amount of Deathclaw in the mix until you're working with an approximate 50-50 split mix leading up to the highlight stages. The cloak will now start showing a really lovely natural orange look, which I want to try and reinforce and brighten further, but without overpowering the tunic and the other leathers. To do this, I added some Lugganath orange into the mix. This will have the same effect that the Baharoth had in the black leathers, and will naturally lighten the hue of the cloak, leading into the final highlight stage. At which point Kislev flesh was added to the mix and applied as an extreme edge highlight just to make the edges and crest of the cloak pop that little bit more and represent where the light will be hitting most prominently. When you're happy with how the cloak is looking, apply a glaze all over with heavily diluted Agrak Zershade.
And there you are. 5 super quick, super easy to replicate variations of cloaks to bring life to your Middle-earth armies or any armies you might be painting in different universes. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to all our patrons who continue to support us. Please don't forget you can check us out there. Link is in the description below. And until next time, guys, take care. And as always, happy hobbying. Bye, guys.